Is that all you do, Alan? Wait, why are you repeating the same joke from last video? No, no, no. What if they don't see last video though? Just do your thing. What? Alan, quit doing a bit and get on and do the video. Plus, I wanted you to do another Donkey Kong one since I still don't see Jungle Beat. Look, I'll probably get the Jungle Beat sometime in the future, man. It's just not gonna be now. Ugh. Jeez. Okay. So let's talk about it. This is my experience with Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy. Alright, this is going to be very brief. Probably one of the smaller ones. Like y'all should go check out my other review on Super Mario Brothers Deluxe. Apparently that shit only got 2 views. Yeah, go check that out. Yeah, not even a joke. Go check that out. Come back to this one. I'm just kidding. Look, watch this one first though. Okay. Welcome, Dave. How you doing? But anyway, so I wanted to talk about this game because I felt like this was one of the most pointless pointless releases Nintendo has up their belt, in my opinion. Alright? Because this is me, right? And I played the game just to give it a test drive, okay? I was like, Donkey Kong Country, right? They already have it for the Game Boy Advance, which I understand the Game Boy Advance ports. Those are completely different. You know, like, for example, the Game Boy Advance, it has an excuse for having Donkey Kong Country. Why does Game Boy Advance have Donkey Kong Country? It's because Mario has freaking Super Mario Brothers 1 to freaking World on that little handheld. So, that makes sense. You know, Game Boy Advance had a lot of remakes and a lot of redos. About to make me some hash browns and hop on Persona 3 Reload. Hey, that sounds what's up, man. Right? So, that makes sense. But Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy? Why? And let me tell you why, right? Why they did it, I actually still don't know. But you get my point, right? So I feel like this experience, the reason why I say my kind of pointless experience with Donkey Kong Country Game Boy Color is because I am literally just playing a shittier version of Donkey Kong Country 1 when I have a multitude of ways to play a better version of it on different systems and hardware. For example, I can play the Super Nintendo one on Nintendo Switch Online for $20 a year. I can play it over there. You know, I can play Donkey Kong Country, whip up a Game Boy Advance emulator, play it that way, Donkey Kong Country 1. You know, another thing, I can go over to my Super Nintendo on emulator if I wanted to and boot it up over there. That's already 3 different ways I can play it, and it's still better than this piece of shit. And another thing that makes me feel like this experience was kind of pointless is and this is hilarious, get this, they have an entire Donkey Kong series specifically for the Game Boy that is heavily based on the Donkey Kong Country games called Donkey Kong Land series. And as you guys know, I recently completed, you know, for playthrough purposes, Donkey Kong Land 1, and I thought it was a decent experience. Sure, it has the Donkey Kong Country gameplay loop where you do your rolls and you're jumping as Donkey Kong and stuff. You're doing the same Donkey Country stuff over there in those games, but that's the difference. That's what makes Donkey Kong Land special. It's pretty much Donkey Kong Country in a way in your hand. That's what makes the Donkey Kong Land series its series, and also having different events, sort of different events sometimes, and whatever. That's what makes those games special. So I don't see what the hell the point of Donkey Kong Country is. And let me tell you, Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color is literally just Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy. That is literally it. Even though sometimes you already have that feeling whenever you're playing Donkey Kong Land 1 already, because there are some levels from Donkey Kong Country in Donkey Kong Land. It's just all level design is different. But yet with Donkey Kong Country Game Boy Color, it just exists. And you know it exists because try looking up Donkey Kong Country 2 and Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Color. Oh yeah, that's right. You can't. Because they never released Donkey Kong Country 2 and Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Game Boy Color. That's why I say this shit is pointless. Like, what was the point of having this game? I mean, I guess maybe if you want to think about it in context, for those who, who can't apparently, can't buy Donkey Kong Land 2 or 3. So they're just like sitting there with Donkey Kong. They're like, oh, a Donkey Kong Country game. I know this is going to be good. Let me just buy this for like, what, 20, 30 bucks? Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color? Ooh, this is nice. Now, don't get me wrong. A demake of a game. And honestly, this is kind of an officially licensed demake. That's the funny part, right? And don't get me wrong. Donkey Kong Country, I will forever love Donkey Kong Country. I am a massive fan of Donkey Kong Country. I mean, if you haven't... Thanks to Donkey Kong Country. I mean, I've become a bigger fan of Donkey Kong than I ever was in the past, So, it's fucking... Donkey Kong is awesome, right? Ryan Grabowski, how you doing? But I'm talking about the useless or pointless port of Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color. And again, like I said, I get it for those who can't afford, the land games or whatever, but it's on the same system. Don't you think that's weird? That's like having Super Mario Odyssey and then having Super Mario Odyssey release again. That's what this feels like. Like, imagine that. Like, you have Super Mario Odyssey on your Switch, peeking, and then on the Wii U, you have a Super Mario Odyssey, or on Nintendo Switch, you have Super Mario Odyssey again, but it's different. It's like the same game, but just worse graphics. Music is like all that other sort of stuff, whatever. Do you want to do a bet? No, it's over the internet. Why would we do bet over the internet? When one person can't even guarantee their side. Only do bets IRL, people. I'm just kidding. Don't do bets. Don't do bets in general. I wouldn't bet anything. But anyways, that's how I feel about this game. It feels kind of pointless. Like, as a game. Like Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color. I get it. For those who want to experience Donkey Kong Country again, but on the Game Boy instead of not having... instead of like going over to the Game Boy Advance and playing it, it's like, hey, I have a Game Boy. Let me just buy it real quick so I can experience Donkey Kong Country. Does it play like Donkey Kong Country? Yes, it does play like Donkey Kong Country. Does it have the music? Yes, but obviously it has to be sounding more like a Game Boy. Even though I feel like the Donkey Kong Land series already does that enough, because they also use music from the Donkey Kong Country game. God, it's like nothing about this port is original. You know what I mean? It's like, wow. I thought this port of Donkey Kong Land, what's not Donkey Kong Land, Donkey Kong Country, right? You know what's crazy? I felt like if Rare didn't waste their fucking time with Donkey Kong Land, I feel like they could have easily made a fourth game in the series to have more than what Donkey Kong Country offered. And if people didn't figure out this fourth game, people would have been like, yo, Donkey Kong Land having 4 games instead of a trilogy of 3? That's actually really cool. And it can be like a whole new and more unique thing than Donkey Kong Land 3 and 2. It could be a completely new game. Kind of think of like the Mega Man series on the Game Boy. Think of that shit, where it's like it had 5 games. 4 games weren't like, I mean, they were original in level design and stage design, but the Robot Masters in those games, they were based off Mega Man games from prior, like Gutsman and Drillman and others, right? And Mega Man 5 for the Game Boy is basically its own unique thing. Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color easily could have been Donkey Kong Land 4 with color and new levels and maybe a new enemy, maybe a new boss, but no. We got Donkey Kong Country 1 for the Game Boy because Rare or Nintendo or both sides or some rando in the party just wanted to port Donkey Kong Country to the Game Boy. Just for some random reason, they just wanted to do that. Anyways, I know it's been 9 minutes, people, and I got another review to do, but it just feels that way whenever you look back and you see Donkey Kong Country. You're just sitting there. Ah, man, I love Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, 3 for my Nintendo Switch, or for my Game Boy Advance, or for the Super Nintendo. Man, I would love to go play a new version of these games like Donkey Kong Country. Ooh, Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color? Now that's rad. Let's see what it's like. It's the same game again. Oh no, I want a different experience. I want my money back. Look, I can picture being a kid back in the time when that game released. Right? When you're a kid, you probably won't think about it. But if you're a kid who has played Donkey Kong Country and just to see Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color, you might think it's neat. But for me, I think it's pointless when it could have been a better game. When it could have been a different game altogether on the Game Boy. That is related to Donkey Kong. That is for Donkey Kong towards Donkey Kong. But Donkey Kong just keeps getting hoed, man. I mean, I get it. Donkey Kong Country was a very good game, so of course they want to like try to sell that success every fucking where, you know, by making ports here, making ports there. But it's like, come on, man. Come on. Why for the Game Boy Color? What makes the DK game so good for you? No, I don't think it's good. It's a pointless experience. Look, a DK game, to make a DK game good for me, obviously, is good level design, good music. I don't really care necessarily about graphics, but you get my point. I mean, I still love how Donkey Kong and Diddy look in the Donkey Kong Country games, even though people say it's outdated. I don't give a fuck about that. But literally, that's what makes a good Donkey Kong Country game for me. Oh, and being completely original. Don't like copy shit. That's why like Donkey Kong Land 2 and 3 didn't really kick, or Donkey Kong Land 2 and 3 for me whenever I did that in the review. That's why I didn't like, I always gave DK Land 1 good shit and DK Land 2 and DK Land 3 shit because they didn't feel original to me. But anyways, my point is this is a pointless fucking port of Donkey Kong Country. And there are better ways of playing it, people. Go play it for Switch Online. Go emulate it for the Game Boy Advance. Or if you have a Game Boy Advance, play it there. Or if you have, like, you know, those weird, those cool little Game Boys and Game Boy Colors. Or not Game Boy Colors. Fuck. You know those retro consoles that aren't really made by Nintendo, but they do emulate that certain library really well? If they're on one of those things, go play it over there because it would be infinitely better than playing Donkey Kong Country for the freaking Game Boy. I'm out. I can't believe I spent 12 minutes talking about this. I'm going to go do another freaking review about a completely different game that we have not seen before on the page. Deuces.